Once enemies, the Assyrians and the Egyptians joined forces against their now ascendant common foe, the Neo-Babylonians. It appears that Josiah may have been killed in a battle with the Egyptian forces of Necho II at the Megiddo on the way to Haran around 609, but there's some doubt about whether that story is reliable. Scholars really aren't sure about the exact way that Josiah perished. Regardless, Judea briefly fell into Egyptian hegemony before the rampaging armies of the Neo-Babylonians, led by Nebuchadnezzar II, would lay siege to the entire region. While a small sample size, I have to admit, the Yahwism of the Lachish letters is actually pretty undeniable. Those letters are a fantastic recovery. That image of Azekah not being visible and the fires going out from the north is just horrifying. And with the destruction of Jerusalem and its Yahweh temple, the theology of the Deuteronomist had come to its apocalyptic conclusion. Yahweh had allowed Nebuchadnezzar to destroy Judea because of their violation of the vassal contract. You still hear this horrifying theology being used today, that the Holocaust was because of Reformed Jews. You still hear it in Haredi circles. Ironically, catastrophic devastation being proof of Yahwism for the Yahwist partisans. This is a trait often shared by theological dead-enders. However, there was a theological wrinkle in this. Nebuchadnezzar II didn't have all the Judeans put to the sword, the kind of total annihilation that one might have expected. Rather, around 7,000 Judeans or so, many members of the priesthood and the aristocracy, likely advanced craftspeople and even farmers, were all carted off to Babylonia to build their empire for them within that empire. One can imagine that if the annihilation would have been total, the last Deuteronomist monoliter could have wagged their finger at the last syncretist as they both perished in the chaos. But that didn't happen. They all kind of just went into exile together, all in one basket, thus maintaining the theological ambiguity, what in the world does any of this mean, and perhaps forcing a solution to be forged in the exile for what had just happened. I thought we were all supposed to be destroyed, and here we are. What does any of this mean? Now, I'm sure that many of the deportees adopted the religious practices of Babylonia, perhaps first through syncretism and then through full-blown assimilation. That's just the fate of many displaced persons through history, and we should never blame them for surviving. Adoption of the dominant culture is often just the best form of adaptation and survival of your family. I don't blame those people in the least. However, it appears that the Judeans were not randomly dispersed into Babylonia. Rather, they were clustered into discrete communities, with one even being referred to as Judean Town. Yehuda, Jewtown. Interestingly enough, dozens of cuneiform tablets from the Judean community in the Babylonian exile do survive down to us. And while none of them record anything like religious literature, and there's no evidence of them building a temple there, though it could have been small, these documents are all just records of financial and trade transactions, like most cuneiform tablets. They do record a very important piece of data. They record names. Of course, people's names don't tell us about their religious lives, but they might inform us, give us at least a hint of some dimension of public religious affiliation. If a person named Pinchas names their son Muhammad, well, one could make a pretty good guess that that Jewish person might very well have converted to Islam before their son was born. And we get data like that, a bit like that, from these tablets. So what does that data reveal? In the Yehudu archive, the Jewtown archive, dating from around 572 to 477, 66% of Judean fathers and 82% of their children had Yahwistic names. The Marashu archive, dating from 452 to 413, are 46 and 67% respectively. In Yehudu region, only 7% of fathers and only 5% of children had Akkadian names, and only 5% of fathers and only 2% of children had non-Yahweh theophoric names. At Marashu, 22% of Judean fathers that is, had Akkadian names, and 17% had non-Yahweh theophoric names. But in their children, that number had dropped to only 5% for both categories. Now, what this data means exactly is difficult to pull out, and it's just one or two sets of data, But what they do show is that all seem to show an increase in Yahweh theophoric names during the exilic period. One could conclude that rather than assimilation into the first generation of the exile, more Yahweh theophoric names might represent an increase of exilic Yahweh partisanship. And that outcome wouldn't be surprising in a community struggling to recreate itself in a foreign land as a community. What do? You simply double down on what you think make you, you, theologically especially and otherwise. However, we also see Judeans using seals that make use of non-Yahwistic imagery. Further, marriage documents between Judeans and Babylonians do summon Babylonian gods to punish those who violate those agreements, and no other gods are invoked in those documents, including Yahweh. Yahweh is just not mentioned in those marriage documents. Though I have to say, in the documents I consulted at least, it was always a Judean woman being wed to a Babylonian husband, and I'm not sure if inverse documents are known to exist, where a Judean man married a Babylonian woman. One might expect to see Yahweh in those documents. I'm just not sure if any of those survive. Also, these documents include being stabbed with an iron dagger if you break the agreement. So, jeez. Now, Smith has also pointed out to a shift in the late pre-exilic period and obviously exilic period, where the tightly controlled familial units and the land that they are attached to as a central unit of social selection has begun to break down under social, economic, and perhaps even theological collapse, and, well, a region racked by constant social instability, often at an apocalyptic scope brought on by vast imperial armies. In this every man for himself nightmare, the literal lands upon which those very familial bonds were set are now stripped out from underneath them by empires. The family is no longer the fundamental unit of society. That's no longer tenable. The elderly grandparents were no longer just fonts of wisdom worthy of respect. You rise for them as they entered into a room or the city of the gates of a city. Those old people were just a liability. In this period of social chaos, independent men capable of immediate brutality may well have risen to the very top of the previous social system, where other things like class origin mattered. Now, if you could cut your way to the top, you could be at the top.